Hey guys, Teresa here. Welcome back to my channel, Lost My Thread. I am very excited to be back again today with my third part of my current Clash of the Pattern series, the Smart Summer Shorts Smackdown. Probably my favorite video when I do one of these series because I feel like this is when we get into the heart of what the sewing process is like, how much I'm enjoying making each of these patterns. If you have not seen the previous videos in this series, it's going to make a whole lot more sense if you do. I'll put a link up here and down in the description box to the playlist if you want to watch along to the first two. Like I said, we are part 3 in the series. In the first video, I told you about the shorts patterns that I was planning to make up, 3 different shorts patterns. In the second video, I told you about how the fit was. I made some muslins, talked about what adjustments I might need to make for the final versions. And I have some shorts, guys. So these are my Pietra shorts by Closet Core Patterns. These are my Dorian shorts by Seamwork. And these are my Palisade shorts by Papercut Patterns. Now, you're not going to see me in these shorts today. That's going to have to wait till the next video, the final video in the series. But what I am going to do today is show you some of the details of these shorts. But really specifically, I want to talk about how are the instructions in these patterns, what was the construction process like, how do they compare across different elements, and what is the finish like when you make the garment. So I'll be showing you some details within the shorts, breaking it down to a way that I think makes it a bit more interesting and digestible. And at the end, I will be showing you the leaderboard and see how things may have shifted. Now, on the whole, I have to say, I think all of these had really pretty good instructions. There's a style of instructions with sewing patterns that I know I like, which is where you have diagrams and then little bite-sized sets of instructions that you can follow along. Not everybody likes a diagram. I know some people prefer photos. So the Palisade shorts, there's actually a sew along on their website, Papercut Patterns, where you can actually look at images of these being made up in real fabric if you are somebody who prefers it that way. Closet Core Patterns don't have a full sew along for the Pietra shorts, but they do have a sew along just for the pocket construction, which I think is really the most complicated part of it. The rest of it is pretty straightforward, so I appreciate that they give that to you if you feel like you wanted a little bit extra. All the patterns had a good glossary of sewing terms, which I think is really important. If you are more of a beginner, you might not know exactly what these terms are meant to be. Seamwork goes a little bit further with the Dorian shorts, so there's actually hyperlinks within the file. So if you're looking at it on a computer, on a tablet, on your phone, then you can actually click through some of these sewing terms to see in the glossary. But they also have links through to some tutorials on their website or on their YouTube channel. So they've got a tips for pressing, guide to sewing denim, pants fitting basics, and how to shorten a metal zipper. The Pietras also had a section before the instructions that was more of a kind of like basic things if you're not familiar with these kinds of techniques. So they had a section for how to braid a seam, do French seams, how to understitch, how to stitch in the ditch, and they also had a link to their pants fitting guide. They do also just include a lot of tips throughout the instructions. So when you're pressing the crotch, it says that it could be useful to use a tailor's ham when you're pressing a curve. And I always appreciate those little extra bits in their instructions. Now, I did have a couple of problems with the instructions themselves. So I'm somebody who likes to print off my pattern instructions, and that's really just because I see sewing as a good opportunity to be phone free, not look at a screen and just spend my time with my sewing machine. But also I like the opportunity to be able to cross things out, make notes on the pattern instructions. So I always print mine off. That was absolutely fine when I was printing off the Dorian shorts and the Pietra shorts. Both of those I just printed as booklet and there was no problem. The Palisade shorts, though, is funny when you actually get the files for that. You get 2 files that are instructions. One is screen friendly and one is printer friendly. And so I was going with the printer friendly, and they were not very printer friendly. So I feel like I don't fully understand how you're supposed to print that file off. When you look and go to like the print options and you see the print preview, it's clearly supposed to be creating some kind of booklet. So it's rotated it to more of like a landscape with 2 pages next to each other. But when you actually print it out double-sided, which is what I did, the pages are all over the place. So there were times when I had to like flip the pages around the other way. So the fold is on the wrong side of the page. So I'm going here from page 12 to page 13 on like the other side of that. And then I have 14 and 15 inside. I don't know if I just was printing wrong, but I don't know how else to print other than just to print double-sided. So I don't quite know how those are supposed to be printer friendly. Maybe you're supposed to do just single-sided, but to me that's a major waste of paper and doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I would have preferred to just print the screen-friendly view as a booklet, and that probably would have worked better for me, but I wasn't going to reprint because I'm not going to waste all that paper. But it was just a bit of a peculiar issue that I had. I also did spot an error in the Dorian instructions. Now, we're all human, people do make mistakes, but it is always a bit of a red flag for me when these small things are missed, and I feel like somebody should have spotted that somewhere in the process for a pattern that I'm paying my money for. And the issue was that the same instruction was mentioned twice. So when it was talking about pressing one of the seams, it says to press to the left when sewing the back rise, using a serger, finish the seam allowance together, trimming off a 1/4 inch, press the seam allowance to the wearer's left side. That's the key. If you don't have a serger, trim off a 1/4 inch, blah, 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 fine. And then the next step is press the seam allowance to the wearer's left side. So they're telling you to do that step 2 times. Again, minor thing, but I wasn't super impressed to see that in the instructions. When you get to cutting these out, I definitely had a different experience across the 3. The Pietra shorts had the least number of pieces, it had 7. The Palisade had 8 pieces and the Dorian had 11 pieces. When I was cutting out the Pietra shorts, the main thing that stood out to me was the number of notches. I do know closet core can be, I think, a little bit excessive over the top with their notches. I wouldn't always put a notch where they put notches. I have to say with this particular pattern, with lining up things with the pockets, I do think they served a purpose, but man, did it feel like a pain when I was cutting those pattern pieces out, and I don't want to miss any of these notches. One of the pattern pieces had 9 notches on it, and I was just really being careful to try and catch every single one of them. So just something to be aware of. The Palisade shorts had a lot less notches, and that was the one pattern that didn't actually have any notches going across the crotch seam, so going down the crotch, the front, and the back. Personally, I'm not really sure how much I ever really need that notch on the crotch seam, unless we're using like a really super slippery fabric. I generally find, because I tend to cut things on the fold with right sides together, when I cut the pattern piece out, it's kind of already lined up exactly where it needs to be to sew that center crotch seam. So if you're sewing that first, which you do on all these patterns, then you don't necessarily need the notches to line them all up. The Dorians were definitely the biggest pain to cut out and to mark. So there were pieces where you had to cut 4. So if I was on the fold, which I was, I had to cut 2 pieces, one on top of the other, and then shift and cut another. There were also a couple of times when you had to cut a piece out on a waistband and then shift down on the fold and cut another one out. I just mention it because I feel like I needed to just be a little bit more alert and paying attention to make sure that I didn't miss cutting anything out that I needed to cut out. But I think the bigger thing that made this one a pain was, in addition to having notches, there were also a lot of circles on this pattern. Now, I think there is a time and a place to have circles and those types of markings where you're going to mark a spot where things need to line up, but there were definitely points where I felt like they had circles where they didn't need to be circles and they could have just been notches. The reason I say it is because I think depending on the fabric, and certainly the fabric that I was working with, it can be quite difficult to mark a pinpoint on a fabric with fabric markers. I was using dark navy blue fabric, so that is my choice, but I felt like because it was a viscose linen blend, even if I put a chalk mark, it's the kind of fabric, it's real kind of floppy and loose. I wouldn't be confident that mark would stay in place, that it might just kind of fall and brush off. So I ended up using tailor's tacks, which is it's just time consuming. And there were 5 different circles that I needed to mark. I don't think there needed to be 5 circles. I think they could have gotten away with 3 circles and I would have been a little bit happier with that. Some of them also needed to be interfaced before you could make those markings, especially if you're using tailor's tacks, I would say. So it's just something to bear in mind. Don't do the tailor's tacks before you do interfacing, iron on interfacing, because otherwise you're going to be ironing your threads in place under the interfacing, which you don't want. All of these had some pretty peculiar pattern pieces because there's a lot of unusual seaming and unusual pockets. And I feel like being able to know which pattern piece you're looking for and wanting to join together is so critical for this. I really love that both the Dorians and the Pietras have one of my favorite things in their instructions, which is they have the symbol for the pattern in the instructions. So often pattern companies will use letters or numbers to identify each pattern piece, and those were both in the diagrams and in the written instructions for both of those patterns, so that way you know you're joining the right piece to the right piece. I will say the Pietras, because they have 3 views for this pattern, it can get confusing at points because it could be any one of 3 letters joining to any other one of those 3 letters to make sure you've got the right pieces going together. If it doesn't make sense, it might be a little bit more clear if you're trying to make these up, but in all honesty, it did take me a minute to try and work out, wait, which one do I have out of these 3 and which one out of these 3 do I have to make sure that I'm joining the right pieces together. It's clear, I think, as it can be, considering they're having to have the instructions for all 3 views, but it does just take a little bit more of a minute to make sure you've got the right piece. The Palisades do have some pretty unusual pattern piece names, but they are not labeled as far as which number or letter in the instructions. And so I think that could definitely throw you off. Now, I, in the past, have just written like the number or the symbol on the pattern pieces, and I'd have to been checking back to make sure I have the right things, but I actually pinned the pattern piece to the fabric, which meant that it was a little bit easier for me to know that I had the right pieces. But yeah, just a little negative point that they don't make it a bit more clear which of these pieces you're working with, especially when they are pieces with some pretty unusual names. One of the things that drew me to all these patterns is that they have quite unusual pockets. And I have to say the pocket construction for all 3 of these were very different from each other, but they were all really fun and interesting, and I found them all very satisfying and nice to put together. The Pietras were a very fun one to put together as far as how they all kind of lined up. When you look at the pattern pieces, you don't really understand how this is meant to end up being a pocket. I do think this is where I think that sew along on their website is quite useful if you're a beginner, because I feel like it's a little bit more clear how things might line up. But I will say, if you read the instructions and you play around with the pattern pieces, you will see if things are lined up properly, those notches line up beautifully. And that is where I think I really do appreciate all those notches being there. And it honestly feels like a little bit of a magic trick, the way you're putting it together and you sort of folding this and placing this on top of this and stitching it, and you're like, oh wait, actually, now I suddenly have a pocket. It was a really fun and satisfying one to make. It was also very satisfying when you were sewing the pocket piece to the side panels. All those matches carry through across all the pieces, so that way you're very confident that everything is lining up exactly how it's supposed to. So that's definitely the moment when I can appreciate all the notches that they put on there. The pocket that itself I think looks really nice and neat. So it is understitched on the inside, which might be a little bit tricky to show you guys. There's no top stitching, it's just understitched, and I feel like it just sits really nice, really neat, straight line. There is some interfacing in there to keep it nice and secure, and I feel like it looks like a really neat pocket. The Palisades had a very fun pocket construction as well. One of the pocket pieces looks like a heart. It folds over itself and that becomes part of the pocket. Again, it was one of those where I feel like if you were given the pattern pieces, you would really struggle to figure out how this becomes a pocket. But when it all comes together, it's really satisfying. So obviously there we've got that double crossover pocket section. So you're essentially creating like a pocket on top of another pocket. There was one part of the instruction I think was slightly confusing where you were folding some of the fabric up and then stitching underneath, but if you just concentrate, follow the instructions, go to the sew along if you need to see it on actual fabric, it does come together really well. Now this one did not have notches on the side seams, like I said, or on the side panel that it's attaching to, which does mean that it is not necessarily as easy to tell or as satisfying to tell that things are lining up. This one is also understitched on the inside of the pocket sections there, so we've got understitching inside there. And so it does sit generally pretty neat. I feel like on the hanger, because there's a lot going on, it's a little bit harder to show you guys, but I do feel like it sits nicely, crosses over well. Again, it's interfaced so that it's got a little bit more structure there, and it's a very fun pocket. The Dorians had the simplest pocket construction, and they are the one pattern that gives you the option of using a different fabric for the lining. So there's a lining for your pocket piece, and that means you get an option of doing something a little bit different. So for these pockets, you're not going to see generally when I'm wearing them, but I've got a fun lining on the inside. I've got this cute strawberry fabric. So this is a fat quarter that I got at a stitch fabric swap a year and a half ago, and I've been waiting for the perfect opportunity to use it. I will say, when you put this one together, you do not understitch the fabric towards the pocket lining, which I would have expected you to do, especially if you're going to have a contrasting fabric. There's more of a possibility that it might peek out, but this one does have some top stitching over the top, so it does keep it all nicely in place. I think the pocket looks good. I think it was a fun one to make as well, and very satisfying to put together. This was the one place where I feel like I did not appreciate there being circles to mark on these pattern pieces. So there were circles on the front and the back sections where the pocket is meant to line up and match up. But honestly, it's kind of, I guess it's 5/8 away from the edge, so it's not sitting right at the edge of the fabric. It was really awkward for me to line the pattern or the pocket piece up with that. I feel like having notches at the very edges or notches across both those pieces like it has on the Pietras would make a lot more sense. I'm not quite sure why they use circles. I didn't actually end up using those circles as a reference point because I didn't think that things were lining up quite right. I actually just used the notches that were further down on the pocket pieces to line things up. So definitely wish that I hadn't spent the time making those circles. Don't fully understand why they chose circles instead of notches. Notches would have been my preference in that instance. Now, the main thing that all of these have in common is having a partial flat waistband and partial elasticized waistband. And it was interesting that they all constructed the waistband quite differently from each other. Definitely going to give some bonus points to the Palisades and the Pietras because both of those you can try them on and adjust the elastic before you stitch it in place permanently. The Dorians, that's not an option for you, so you want to make sure that you got the fit right before you make those, or at least make a muslin, or you may need to make adjustments later on, which would be much more tedious. Now, I did mention in my previous video, as much as you can try those on, it's before the center crotch seam is sewn, so if you don't know exactly what the rise is, you might not be making the elastic the right length for depending where it's going to sit on your body. So at the very least, measure the rise or check the rise on there compared to your body to make sure that you're going to have the elastic sitting where you want it to. The Dorian shorts had the most complicated waistband construction, but that is not surprising because this is a fly front, so it's always going to be a bit more complicated to put that together. But I've made a lot of fly fronts, and this was definitely a more complicated one than I've done before. There were 5 separate pieces going around the waistband, which you then had to double up because it was then sort of faced on the inside as well. So you had 2 of each. One half of it was going to be interfaced. Now this is one place where I will say, put my hand up, I made a boo-boo, I made a mistake, I did not look at the instructions properly enough. You interface one side of it that is meant to be the inside of the waistband. Usually when you are cutting out pattern pieces on interfacing, you just lay them down on the interfacing, glue side down, and cut them out. I assumed that was going to be the case with this pattern. I did not check, but actually for this one, they wanted you to flip the pattern piece upside down and cut it around that way. I've got to be honest, I don't really understand why the pattern pieces just were not the other way around. To me, that seems like a mistake that they made, and then they're fixing it by telling you to flip that pattern piece around. Anyway, I ended up cutting it the wrong way around so that the interface section was actually on the outside rather than the inside as it was intended. The main reason that made a difference is because you actually understitch that waistband on the inside to keep the inner waistband on the inside, but I then had that line of stitching on the outside. So what I decided to do instead was just to top stitch all the way around to make it symmetrical. You were actually meant to top stitch at the bottom edge of that waistband anyway, and to be honest, I feel like I prefer for it to be consistent all the way around, so I kind of like the way it worked out anyway. I think it looks good, and I think if I just had the stitching there and not on these sections, it would look a little bit strange and out of place to me, so I'm calling it a happy accident. The Dorians also had 2 methods of constructing the waistband. They gave you 2 options, fully detailed. They tell you to read through both before you decide how to make the waistband. I have to be honest, I also don't really understand why there are 2 different options. I think it would make sense if they explain that, like, option 1 is maybe a bit simpler but doesn't have as nice of a finish, but option 2 has a nicer finish but is a little bit trickier, so maybe if you're not as experienced, try that one. I think in general it just seemed kind of random to me. I couldn't see that one of them was necessarily easier or better than the other. I went with option 1 because I read it and it made sense, and I was like, look, let's just go with what that is. I feel like they couldn't decide themselves which one they thought was better or easier and just threw both in there. The The reason I feel that way is because there is just no explanation about why you would choose one over the other. So I don't really understand why the two are there. And to me, it just felt like, I don't know, just indecisiveness on their part. The Pietras had a separate facing that goes on the inside of the front of the shorts, and that is what they call a pocket stay. And basically it's an interface section that goes across the whole front panel that keeps things a bit flatter, and I think it's meant to keep your tummy a bit flatter. I wasn't sure if it would be comfortable to have that there. Didn't bother me when it was there, and I feel like it created a really nice look overall. So you do some top stitching from the outside, stitching in the ditch to make sure that everything lines up and stays there nicely. From the inside, this is what the facing piece looks like. Now, they give you options of how to finish the bottom edge of this facing piece. They say that you can serge it or zigzag it, or you can do a bias binding finish, which to me is a beautiful finish. I always really appreciate that kind of finish inside garments, and I was able to use some scrap bias binding that I have, and I feel like that just really adds something to it and makes it look really nice and slick. So in general, I found that a really nice way to put that together. I found the whole waistband construction generally was pretty straightforward. There is some top stitching on the back waistband, and they do specifically tell you to put that 3/4 of an inch spaced apart, and they say that it is not optional. So for this particular pattern, they say that it really does affect the fit. If you have that top stitching on there, you really need to do it. And I agree. I think it would be really annoying and twisty and shift around and bunch up if you didn't have things stitched in place. So I'm glad that they said that that was essential. The Palisade was a pretty similar construction, not exactly the same, but really pretty similar. So there is actually just a folded over section that creates the waistband at the front, which also is very much the same at the back. This one though, as far as the finish on the front there, they just tell you to use an overlocker or a serger before you stitch it down. And it's fine, it's just not quite as slick as the Pietras. They do also say to use these rows of top stitching as optional. They don't say you have to use them, and they don't tell you how far apart to space them. Now, I think you could potentially not bother with the top stitching here. It goes a bit further around the body, so maybe it wouldn't bunch up as much, but I do feel like you could end up with odd lumpy bits. I feel like the top stitching is definitely something I would recommend, and I would always go with that option personally. Looking at the front of the shorts, I do feel like the Pietras in general look really nice and neat. Like I said, you've got that stitching in the ditch to keep that facing in place, and there's also optional top stitching, so you don't have to put the top stitching there going down the leg seam, but I think it's a nice detail. I appreciate it there, and I feel like the whole thing looks pretty slick. The Palisades do also have that top stitching detail, though it is not optional. They tell you to put it on there. This one also has the faux front fly. I like the shape of the faux front fly. I am honestly on the fence about whether or not I think it adds anything. So you can kind of open, but there's nothing there because it's all stitched together. The main thing that bugs me though about this fly is the interfacing is visible on the inside, which I don't think it should be. This should really be on the other part. So both of these pieces had like a section sticking out for the faux fly, and I think it should have been on the opposite piece so that it would be covered over. I could have stitched this the other way around so that way the interfacing was going to be covered up, but that would make the opening to the fly and sort of the top stitching on the faux fly on the wrong side, and that would definitely look really strange. If you look at the diagram, essentially they have put it on the wrong side of the leg, so it really should have been on the right side, so it needs to be the other way around. So I've written on my interfacing pattern piece to flip it the other way if I'm making this in the future. But honestly, I'm not even sure that I really need that faux fly there. I'm somewhat considering unpicking and just taking it off on this pair. Watch this space, we'll see. It's fine. It's just one of those things that bugs me. You know, you see the inside of the garment when you're putting things on, and I feel like I just shouldn't be able to see that interfacing. The Dorian shorts does not tell you to do any top stitching. I think it probably would have been a nice detail, but it's fine that it's not there. It's not a big deal. And this one has a proper fly, so there's a button and there's a zipper, so it opens and closes, you know, like a fly. I will say the fly construction on these shorts was like no fly construction that I've ever done before. When I was looking to see what resources were out there from the different companies, Seamwork do actually have a video where they're talking about fabric recommendations for this pattern. That's the only video where they talk about it. But in that, they do mention, oh, if you haven't tried our fly construction, try our fly construction, because it's like none you've ever done before, which is true. I will say for me, it was different, but I don't know why it was different. It felt like it was different to be different. I certainly did not find it easier. I did not feel like things lined up well. My notes that I made for myself, because I make notes as I'm going and making these instructions, was fly construction bites. So clearly I was not a big fan of constructing this fly. I made a muslin of this and it generally came together okay, but when it came to putting together the real pattern pieces, there's a section of the instructions where you basically have part of the fly is trimmed, sort of cut to where that circle is and folded back. And it's not very clear to me that it's supposed to be another piece that's kind of sticking out behind it when you're stitching it together. If it doesn't make sense, I tell you guys, it didn't make a whole lot more sense while I was constructing it. Making the fly on this particular pair of shorts, it really took me back to my early days of sewing back in like the late 90s, where I was working with the Big Four with no additional resources, and I would have to sometimes take a pause and like leave the pattern and come back to it later because I was completely confused. I was not delighted to have that experience again because I have not had that experience in some time. I've made a lot of flies. I do not love their fly construction. The other part of it to me that just doesn't work is that you're supposed to be connecting it to the center crotch seam, but the fly itself should be extending a little bit beyond that seam. But on this pattern, it doesn't. So basically you're gonna end up with this little nudge, this little area that, I don't know if I can show you guys really. It's never going to be completely straight because you're having to sort of bump over so that the zipper can sit a little bit further back. I do also prefer my zipper to be further to the side of the fly itself. This is really quite close to the edge, and I had a pretty thin zipper, but if you were using like a metal zipper or a jean zipper, which is I think what they recommend, I feel like that would be constantly visible or just like right on the edge of visible, which I do not love. I think it came out pretty neatly. I think the shape of it, honestly, is slightly odd. It's a bit flatter at the bottom than most flies that I've made. I also feel like the inside, I wouldn't have minded another little bar tack on this side just to tack that zipper facing down, but it wasn't in the instructions and I just went with the instructions. I don't think anyone looking at it is gonna have a problem with it. I think it's just my own personal standards. This was the best I could do, but I don't think I could ever do it better using their fly construction. There was even one element where you were clipping quite close to a circle and I didn't feel like my fabric was gonna necessarily like being trimmed that far back. I was a bit concerned about the longevity of this pair of shorts if I'm washing it over time. I didn't love the fly. I'm not gonna pretend that I did. The other thing I will say is they do have links to YouTube videos and Seamwork pages where they talk to you about different elements, like, you know, top tips for pressing. I feel like the one area they really could have done with is a video or even potentially a photo sew along of how to make their unusual fly. They know it's an unusual fly construction. That is the bit that we could have used more support in, and I probably, hopefully, wouldn't have had to unpick quite so many times. For the hem of the shorts, I am a fan of a good chunky hem. I feel like that is a cute look with shorts. I feel like it works well. The Pietras had the favorite of mine, so this is actually folded back 1/2 inch and then 2 inches to give a good, nice, deep 2-inch hem. The Palisades have a 1.5 inch hem, which I think is absolutely fine. But the only thing I didn't like was that instead of folding something back and back again, you actually just finish or serge the edge of the hem before you stitch it down, which I think is, again, it's just not as nice of a finish on the inside. The Dorian shorts had quite a narrow hem where you fold it up 1/4 inch and then 1/2 inch. So it's just a little 1/2 inch hem, which just as a personal thing, I just don't like the look of it as much. I think that is a nicer hem if it's a bit deeper. So looking at the overall finish of these, the Dorian shorts, I think on the whole, look pretty good. I do really appreciate getting to have a little bit of fun with the lining of that pocket. That's a really nice detail. I think from the outside and from the inside, they look pretty good, apart from that fly just not being my favorite fly, and I think it just looks a little bit sloppy, a little bit less slick. I think the Palisades have a good finish from the outside. I think they look good, but like I said, those details of not as neat of a finish at the bottom of the waistband, at the top of the hem, and then having this interfacing visible on the inside. I like my garments to be as beautiful on the inside as they are on the outside. And so definitely my favorite finish has got to be the Pietras. I feel like they are lovely on the outside, beautiful detail, particularly with this bias bound edge, which is optional, but I like that they mention it as an option. I like the option, and I feel like inside and out, these are definitely the prettiest pair of shorts. Looking at the highlights of all the bits that I've talked about to try and see where these are going to be sitting in my leaderboard, I do think they all had really pretty good instructions apart from my obvious issues with the flag construction of the Dorians. I think the Dorian and the Pietras had the most beginner-friendly instructions. I think they held your hand the most, gave you more additional details if you're a beginner. I do think you could make the Palisades if you had maybe made one or two things before. I think their online sew along is definitely going to be a bit more helpful, but I feel like that would maybe be slightly more challenging if you're just a beginner. The Pietras, I have to say, were the easiest and the quickest to put together. Some of these things are down to the design element, so I appreciate that a simpler design is going to be simpler to create. The Palisades were the next quick and easy to make, and the Dorians were definitely the most complex, but we knew that was going to be the case because of the fly. So I don't want to hold too much against it, but just if you do want to have an idea of what was quick, what was easy, that's definitely the order. On the whole, I did prefer the construction method for the Palisades and the Pietras. I feel like it made sense. I didn't always understand quite what was going on with the Dorians. And as far as the finish, I think the Pietras definitely have the edge, and they were my favorite to look at just sitting on a hanger. At the end of the last round, the top of the leaderboard was the Pietra shorts, followed by the Palisades with the Dorians at the bottom. Looking at everything from today, what I like and didn't like about these patterns, I've got to be honest, I don't think there's really anywhere for these to shift. I think the Pietras definitely had some major plus points keeping them up at the top. I think the Dorians had some major negatives which keep them down at the bottom, and the Palisades are just sitting there cruising right in the middle. Obviously, sewing these things up is very different from having a finished garment, wearing a finished garment. The next video in this series, I will be showing you these shorts on my body, styled in a variety of ways, and I will tell you which of them I like the best for me and which is the final winner of the Smart Summer Shorts Smackdown. I hope you enjoy getting into the nitty-gritty details of these instructions. Definitely let me know if you have any thoughts or opinions on things that I liked or didn't like about them, if you've had similar experiences sewing these patterns or other patterns up. It's always really fun for me to get into the detail, and I always love that you guys appreciate it as well. If you did enjoy the video, as always, please do give me a thumbs up. Make sure you're subscribed to my channel if you want to see upcoming videos. I'll be back soon and see you then. Bye!